Well, hello everybody, and thanks Dana for the very nice music. We got a comment in chat about it. So welcome to everybody to tonight's edition of Let's Talk About Hanford, which is themed insects of Hanford. As you know, for those who are new to these events, these are just this is our Let's Talk About Hanford series where we kind of hone in on a specific Hanford topic, and we do a presentation, and then we have a really great dialogue with those that are attending about any questions they have about that topic. We've done, I think, more than a dozen of these now, and they're super fun. And tonight we're welcoming George Peck from our own office. So we're super excited for that. And Dana, I'll go ahead and kick it over to you for some housekeeping, and then we'll hop right into it tonight. And I think you're muted, Dana.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Dana McFadden, also at the Nuclear Waste Program, and tonight we are going to be talking about insects. And so we've got just a couple of housekeeping things. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat box, either on Zoom or on Facebook, whichever one you're listening into. Our structure is going to be that George is going to give us his very interesting presentation. And then after that, we're going to have our live Q&A. So we'll read the questions that come up in the chat, and we also will enable the cameras and the mics so that if you want to ask your question on camera live, you're welcome to do that also. Or just leave it in the chat and we'll read it. Whatever works. Oh, and you can also raise your hand. I always forget about that one. We encourage all sorts of questions as long as they're about tonight's topic, insects. We try to keep it focused on that. If you have other questions or questions that are too complex for tonight, we will defer those questions either to a future event or answer them offline if it just doesn't meet the topic tonight, or sometimes they get real complicated. You can also send questions to our email if you think of something later after we're all done and you're like, wait, I really wanted to know about this black bug. You can send it to our email at hanford@ecy.gov, and we will be happy to follow up with you. If for some reason we have so many questions tonight that we're just looking like we're going to go forever, and we can't get to your question, we commit to following up with you to figure out, to get you a good answer for that. So now I'm going to send it back to Ryan.
Wonderful. I'll be short here. The only other point I was going to make, I think, was we did enable captioning if anybody would like live captions. I think, though, if you're on Zoom, you have to go to the more box and actually turn on the captions yourselves. I think they might automatically be on, but Zoom's weird sometimes. So if you don't see captions and you want them, you'll just have to go to the more box and then enable them. With that being said, though, Dana will go ahead and get our slides put up. And while she's doing that, George, if you want to just introduce yourself and who you are, and then we'll go ahead and get rolling in tonight. And thank you again so much for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. It's my pleasure. So my name is George Peck. My training is in entomology. I have a degree in entomology from the University of California, where I worked mostly in mosquito ecology. I've worked all over the United States on West Nile virus. I worked in Texas for the Department of Public Health on just about everything down there. They've got all sorts of things down there that harm you: sandflies, mosquitoes, ticks, human louse, fleas. I've worked for the Army, actually, working at the Walter Reed Institute in Maryland near the Washington, D.C., doing work on medical maggots, fly maggots that actually can be used to clean wounds that are having a difficult time healing. I've been to Peru to test mosquito traps and repellents and attractants. The outdoors are my passion. I'm always curious about the natural world, and I think that's what drew me into entomology. So tonight I'm going to share a little bit of that with you. And my role at Ecology is primarily in the waste management division. So it's a new transition for me. And so I'm kind of sharing my old career here, but the work we do in ecology is part and parcel of helping the natural world to heal itself. And Hanford is one of those places where the natural world has put up with a lot of changes over the years. and is desperately trying to recover. So we'll talk about that. So with no further ado, let's move right into what we'll cover tonight. That would be next slide, please. We'll talk a little bit about the importance of insects. Then we'll talk about the Hanford biodiversity and the human impacts that have occurred there. I'll talk a little bit about the geology, the fire ecology, the invasive species that have impacted. I've got a golden retriever, so we had a doorbell ring, so I apologize for that. Invasive species, we've got plant communities that we'll be talking about, insects that depend on those plants. I'll talk a little bit about Hanford pollinators, and then we'll have some closing remarks. It's a lot to cover, but Hanford's got a lot to cover, and insects are a huge, huge, huge topic that can take a lifetime of study to even begin to understand. So I think that's why I'm excited about it. So let's dig right into it. Next slide, please. So let's just introduce ourselves to insects. For those that know a lot about insects, or some of us maybe don't think about insects very much at all, but it comes from the Greek word for six-legged. It comes from this phylum of living organisms called hexapoda. They're very abundant, perhaps some of the most abundant organisms on the earth, other than, say, bacteria and viruses and so forth. They perform important services, pollination being one of them. They're also basal consumers. They're way down in the food chain. They are the workers, the movers, the shakers, the little folks that get things done in the world. They're scavengers, they're detritivores. They work to clean up and recycle in a big way that we hardly notice at all. They also perform micropredation, keeping each other in check, kind of checks and balances to keep things in balance in the natural systems throughout the world. And they have a general body plan that always gives them away. They have 6 legs, they have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. And all of this is readily available. So each slide will have links to websites that you could explore if you're interested for more information. Next slide. So to give you a sense of the diversity of this group of organisms, they've been grouped into roughly 31 orders, and there's roughly 1 million species that have been named. But depending on who you talk to, there are at least between 5 and 30 million undescribed species of insects. So I direct your attention now to this interesting, what we call phylogenetic tree, and it's in a circular form. Those are fancy words. What I want you to understand about the tree is that all of these colors and lines represent the evolution and the diversity through time of all the insect orders. When we go to the very center of the circle there, we go back roughly 400 million years to the fossil records that give us some clue as to the very beginnings of insect life. And so those black lines in the very center would be the very most primitive insects like silverfish and springtails and those types of insects. And then the next ones to evolve, maybe it was 300 million years ago or so, maybe 300 to 400 million years ago during the Carboniferous era. Those would be things like dragonflies and other aquatic insects. And then as we go further out in circles, we see that there's more and more evolution occurring, that insects are invading the land in greater and greater numbers. They're diversifying into many, many niches throughout the terrestrial habitat. They're finding different types of lifestyles to make a living. And so it really does form a complex system. And so later on in the talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about a family of insects called sesiomyids, which are gall midges, which basically are tiny flies. And they evolved relatively recently in the big picture of insects. So they're very small, very diminutive, insects, roughly less than 1 millimeter to 3 millimeters in length. There's about 6,000 species of those midges described, but through a process called DNA metabarcoding, which is really a fancy way of figuring out through DNA what is out there in a given sample, like a soil sample or an air sample or a water sample. Scientists feel like there's over 1 million species just of this one family of midges that are completely unaccounted for or understudied. So there's really so much that we don't know about the insect world. And so it's very important that we study it. And I want to bring that to your attention tonight. Next slide. The importance of insects. So first of all, they are part and parcel, a very important part of agriculture. They perform pollination services. And I've heard it said, if you went to Fred Meyer and you said, okay, Fred, take everything out of the store that was or had to do with pollination, every single item, remove it from the store. And so Fred Meyer takes everything out of the store that was directly or indirectly involved in a pollination process, and roughly half to 2/3 of the store would be empty. So super important process, pollination, and billions of dollars are caught up in pollination services each year. Insects also do damage, depending on the cropping system, pesticides used, and so forth. It can be between 10 and 50% reduction in yield in a given agricultural system, but that adds up to billions of dollars worldwide each year. And then we store the food that we grow, but when we store it, insects also attack it. So billions can be lost each year to stored products as well. And then in public health, insects impact us in terrible ways all through history and time. As we speak, mosquitoes are still a big transmitter of disease throughout the world. Ticks are very important, more so as we learn more about the different diseases they vector. Fleas have been important throughout history and still are important. Human louses or lice. I suspect that over in Gaza, as people are forced to live in close quarters, that human louse or human lice will begin to transmit typhoid. So when we forget about insects, they come back and they bring back all these diseases that we thought we'd never see again if we give them the right conditions for it. And then urban pests, we all know that we put up daily with termites, ants, wasps, and others in our home. The hospitality industry fights daily battles with bed bugs and perhaps human body lice. And then in the food service industry, we always have roaches, flies, and maybe beetles to contend with. So insects are in our world and in our life and impacting us greatly. Next slide. Now, what's all this crisis? What about the crisis? When I went through graduate school, I learned, well, I came into graduate school kind of at the Rachel Carson level. Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring back about 1960, a very controversial book, attacked by the chemical industry. But people understood that the logic and the science behind it was strong. And the arguments were sound. President Kennedy and others took the advice of Carson and created environmental laws to protect us from the destructive effects of insecticides that were used indiscriminately. As we speak today, there's a number of books that have been published in the last few years that show that the latest research is rather dire. We're losing insects all over the world. Depending on who's observing them. In countries that have a lot of money for research, insects are well tracked, and we know exactly how many have gone extinct over time. In other countries where there's really no money to study insects, we don't know. But in general, between 5 and 10% are presumed extinct since the Industrial Revolution. So that's a lot of insects. So it's important to keep that in context when we talk about Hanford and our efforts to restore it to a natural state. Next slide. What drives insect extinctions? Well, habitat loss and fragmentation. So that's absolutely the story at Hanford. There's been a lot of habitat loss and a lot of fragmentation of the habitat at Hanford. There's been pollution at Hanford, not so much recently, but before 1940, there were orchards there, and lead arsenate was sprayed pretty regularly. Invasive species, we'll talk about that a little bit later. Climate change impacts the entire planet, and Hanford's not exempt from that. So weather patterns, changes in precipitation, humidity, temperature over time. Insects can handle some of that, but there are some more sensitive than others that may feel the effects of that. Overexploitation, that usually happens when the insect's very beautiful to collect and it's over-collected and maybe completely exploited that way. And then there's also co-extinctions when one organism's dependent on an insect or vice versa. And so let's say there's a beautiful orchid in a beautiful rainforest and everyone wants that orchid, and then it's driven to extinction by collection. And there may be a bee that is uniquely coupled to that orchid that needs that orchid for a food source, and the orchid needs the bee and vice versa. So there's a number of examples like that. Now, the other half of this graph talks about ecosystem functions, and so that's an important thing too. And all of those things I'm going to kind of touch on, but they're all really important. And in the last couple of decades, we've learned that we need to measure these effects about ecosystem function so we can make good arguments when we talk to everyone about why we need insects. It's not just their beauty or because we think it's really fascinating what they do, but they perform things that are worth a lot of money to the economy. Next slide. Hanford itself has a number of documents that speak to the conservation of biological resources. The particular one that I've pulled up here, it's mentioned at the bottom. You can actually find this on the web and read it. It's a rather long document. I think it's roughly 90 pages. But it's well written, and it delineates exactly what the intent of the Department of Energy is for Hanford going into the future about preserving its natural resources. Next slide, please. Included in this biological resource management plan are a collection of important laws: the Endangered Species Act, the Environmental Policy Act, Migratory Bird Act, CERCLA or Superfund Act, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, the Clean Water Act, and 8 other acts or executive orders that are all interwoven into the document in such a way that provide the reader with legislative support for any actions that are occurring in terms of conservation within Hanford. Next slide. This is a change of pace or a change in gears. This is drawn from an ecological monitoring document at Hanford, and I've provided the link here in the slide. And it's very interesting that these plant communities around Hanford, which is that dark thatched area in the center of the 2 images, and the areas all the way up into Wenatchee and all the way out to Pullman and into Idaho and down into northern Oregon, had a certain plant communities that were part of them, or that were those native communities that existed for millions of years before Europeans arrived on the scene. And mostly in the Hanford area, it was considered big sagebrush habitat. And then on the other side, on the right-hand side, once Europeans settled the area, began agriculture, we see that, well, roughly 70 to 80% of that sagebrush was converted into croplands for hay, for pasture, for legumes, all sorts of uses. But to do that, there was massive land conversion. And along with that, destruction of native plants and animals, and necessary to fulfill the destiny of the settlers. So that's the context we have currently across the Hanford site, is we have a disturbed habitat that was pristine at one time, but has been converted for different uses. Next slide. Geology and meteorology at Hanford. So for those of you that have lived out there, this should be very common knowledge. It's very hot and dry during the summer and cold and rather wet during the winter. The average low is about 31 degrees in January, and the average high is about 77 in July, and the average precipitation is about 7 inches per year, and that was averaged over 1945 to 2015. The soils have their own history. Down at the very base of everything, there is a huge layer of basalt, perhaps miles thick. But due to the Missoula flood phenomenon over thousands and thousands, perhaps millions of years, I've read that there were over 100 Missoula floods that may have occurred, but over time we only can see evidence for roughly a dozen or so that we know for sure. But the bottom line is it's a very sandy, loamy, stony cobblestone milieu with a few outcrops of basalt. But in general, it's a very well-draining soil. And so that in turn affects what plants can thrive in the habitat. Next slide. And so right away, I just want to jump ahead of the plant communities and just mention the current state of invasive species. So we'll touch on this a little bit later, but we have the big sagebrush habitat at Hanford that was impacted and continues to be impacted by cheatgrass. And folks that do grazing and farming throughout Central Washington know what cheatgrass is and know that it's not always the best thing to have around, and it can be a noxious weed. It was introduced in 1860 and it spread to South Central Washington by 1928. The thing that I want everyone to realize is it creates a fire cycle that is too frequent to allow native plants to reestablish in their natural way. Big sagebrush is moderately fire tolerant because it can re-sprout from the root crown. And then it also can reproduce from seed if there's enough moisture. But in areas of Hanford where there have been fires, you can see in this lower right-hand picture here that you've got the sagebrush itself is being crowded out by almost pure cheatgrass. And so that in itself creates difficulties for native insects that are not used to getting around in a cheatgrass dominated environment. Next slide. Okay, no insect lives without its plant. So let's talk about the dominant plants on the Hanford Reserve. So there's 4 main plants that I want to talk about this evening. Big sagebrush, 3-tip sagebrush, gray rabbitbush, and green rabbitbush. So these are fairly common plants, and where the area is not disturbed, you'll see them growing in large stands, sometimes small, sometimes large. This past autumn, the rabbitbush started to bloom roughly in late August with beautiful orange inflorescences, and then lasted into late September. So these are the 3 important dominant plants that I want to cover tonight, but I just want you to realize that there's many, many plants out there and many, many insects that interact with those plants. But in the interest of time, we just can't go deeply into everything in one night. Next slide. So to focus just on the big sagebrush, roughly 1 to 3 meters tall, a very deep taproot, 1 to 4 meters, laterally spreading roots as well. And again, there's groundwater from precipitation and below ground. It has flowers, but they're very small. In the photo on the left there, the upper left, those are the cryptic blossoms of the sagebrush. They hardly look like flowers at all, but they are. It also has a strong fragrance due to oils and other volatile chemicals in the leaves, and that prevents, say, deer from grazing on it. but there's insects that have evolved ways to neutralize all those oils and are able to eat the plant. And we'll learn about those in a moment. Next slide. And the insect that I want to mention at this point is called a galling insect. So a gall in entomology, in insect world, is an abnormal growth, an outgrowth of plant tissue. And there are certain insects that can induce galls in plants. So next time you're out in a wild or even in just an urban area, if you notice that certain plants, say oak trees or any ornamental could be affected, has something might look like a funny growth, a bulbous growth where it should be growing normally, that's most likely a gall. And insects do this by inserting their egg into the plant tissue. And the insect interacts with the plant growth, kind of like we'd kind of like a cancer within the plant, so to speak, is that the insect influences the plant to grow rapidly around that inserted insect egg. And so these galls can take different forms. Here are 3 that are mentioned on a website called gallformers.org. And that website cites 34 species of gall-forming insects just on big sagebrush. Now, those insects may or may not be on Hanford, but it gives you an idea of the dependence of many species on just one type of plant, just for a place for their young to be nourished and grow as they grow into an adult form. And so on the lower left there, you can see a typical sesiomyid ovipositing or laying an egg onto a grass stem. And that's the exact way that these little midges do it. They just puncture the plant tissue, insert an egg, and that egg goes to work in signaling the plant, grow big, grow big, grow big. And it grows a little house around the insect egg. The egg goes through all of its metamorphosis and eventually emerges as an adult midge, just like the one here in the photo or similar, at the end of its life cycle to an adult. This is just an idea of the diversity that occurs on a particular sagebrush plant. And there is a third layer of interesting ecology here, because these galling insects are creating diversity and supporting diversity as ecosystem engineers. And we'll see that in the next slide, where I'll show you that there's parasitic insects on the galls themselves. So these galls that we're looking at right here, they look like maybe a rotten potato, or maybe a pot scrubber kind of a gall, or maybe one just a bloated gall. Let's go to the next slide and look at some of the wasps that can be parasitic just upon the insects that are inside those galls. And they're all wasps. They're all fairly very, very small wasps, some less than 1 millimeter long, but they all can be specialized in some cases on a certain galling insect. That's the beauty and diversity that we see in these systems when we look for it. And as I say earlier in the talk, there's roughly 6,000 midges that are classified and understood, but in some cases we think there's just thousands and thousands more that still need to be understood. And the same is true for these parasitic wasps. They're so small, and there's so few people studying them on a large scale that many, many, many of them are just completely undiscovered and in need of study. It's a very fascinating subject that we can touch on at another time. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, we're switching gears again. I'm talking invasive insects now instead of invasive plants. And I bring your attention to a walking trail right next to Washington State University Tri-Cities. So this is just south of the Hanford site, maybe 3 miles from the actual government fencing that demarks the Hanford area. So the plants and insects are roughly the same. And what I noticed as I was walking along this bike trail the other night, I think it was in mid-September, it was about 80 degrees. And I approached this big sagebrush. And as I got closer to it, I saw some black things. What are those? And I looked closer and got out my cell phone and snapped a couple of photos. They're dermapterans, they're earwigs. These are they're brought from Europe. They're herbivores. And in this particular case, the sagebrush is probably producing a meal of pollen for them. Maybe a mixture of pollen and some nectar. But they were there in great numbers that night, feeding on this native plant, even though they were brought from Europe. So that in many cases, an invasive plant, an invasive insect can find its own niche within a new ecosystem that it's just been introduced to. That being said, in the lower right-hand corner, the red circle is demarcating a wasp. And if I think it's Vespa, I think it's Vespula vulgaris, which is also brought to the United States by Europeans. And so the predators follow the prey if they're allowed to, and can act as a control device in that case too. So these are more of the interesting interactions that are occurring near or on Hanford. Next slide. Moving to the other species that I was going to cover tonight, which would be the rabbit bush. As I was saying, these bloomed this summer from roughly late August to late September. I would walk almost daily and observe the different species pollinating them. I have to say pollinators on the Hanford site need to be a pretty rough and ready group. It's usually pretty windy on some nights, and it's a pretty dry ecosystem. There's not a lot of food sources between that early flush of spring flowers, say in May and June, and then all the way till late August when the rabbit bush starts to bloom. What I want to just mention about these is that we have a skipper butterfly, which is a fairly common at Hanford. I've seen a number of them on the rabbit bush. The second one just below the skipper, the lichenid, these can be very rare in certain parts of the world. And I know there are a number of threatened or endangered species of butterflies in or around the Hanford area, and we can cover those in a future talk. On the far left, we have something that wouldn't normally show up on a rabbit bush. It's actually a mayfly, and it turns out that mayflies live very, very short lives. As an adult, maybe 3 days, and they actually have no mouth parts. They don't need to eat. They just bring all of their energy as adults from their larval habitat, which is the river. They're aquatic insects when they're in their larval form. And so I asked myself, well, why is this mayfly ending up on a plant? And one possible idea that I thought of was that maybe it's just waiting for a mate. Sometimes insects are very attracted to orange colors, and so it may just be waiting for a male or a female to fly on down so it can do its duty and get the new generation going. And then finally, on the very right-hand side, these are some photos I took about 6 weeks ago. The top right is a beetle. And what's interesting about that beetle, it has what's called aposematic coloring. That means that it looks like something that is distasteful or dangerous. And in this case, with the black and yellow striping, it's probably telling any would-be predators, hey, I've got a stinger, even though I don't. I look just like a wasp or a bee, don't touch me. And in the lower right, well, first thought is that, well, that's just a honeybee, but entomologists in the group would tell you no, that's a good guess, but this is actually a fly. If you look very closely, it has fly-like eyes. It has very, very small antennae that are almost invisible. And then if you look really, really close, you can see it only has one pair of wings, whereas a bee would have 2 pairs of wings. So a mimicry where the fly evolved over millions of years to look like a bee, so it wouldn't get harassed while it was taking nectar or a pollen meal from the rabbit bush. So those types of interactions, millions of years old, are all part of the Hanford milieu. Next slide. Okay, the final subject that I want to cover tonight are pollinators. And I can just briefly touch on this, and I'm going to cite a paper that was sponsored by the Department of Energy. And this was an important paper. I'll be giving a few important facts from that. And I just want to remind you, these bulleted points here point out again that pollinators are really important. They facilitate plant reproduction by moving pollen from flower to flower. They're vital to the world's ecosystems and to our food supply. These mutualistic relationships have evolved on every continent and over millions of years, and some of them are very general and some are very specific. And then finally, by enabling successful plant reproduction, pollinating insects support the health of nearly all other organisms in the environment that rely on healthy plant populations. So think of something, say, a successful pollination of a sunflower could lead to viable sunflower seeds, and then those seeds would be eaten by mice, and then those mice would be eaten by an owl. That owl might, or those mice might also be eaten by coyotes. And then also healthy plant reproduction means that there'll be plenty of forage available in the spring for the elk and the deer that call Hanford home. So absolutely an essential ecosystem service. Next slide. This study was conducted between April to October 2017. There were 4 study sites: the steppe grassland, which is a bunch grass habitat, the rabbit bush dominated areas, and they call it an early colonizer because rabbit bush kind of can make its way into an area if it's not pushed out by bunch grass. They chose to also sample a mixed shrub, so a mid-successional mix of hop sage, sagebrush, bitterbrush, and rabbit brush. So all of the dominant plants that were maybe coming back after the fires, because there have been a number of fires at Hanford. And then there's mature sagebrush. So 4 habitats were sampled, and they sampled from 2 sites within each habitat. And they used kind of a bird bath configuration of what we call a pitfall trap, or basically it's just a kind of a pie pan with maybe soapy water inside of it. And the pan may be orange colored to attract the pollinator. And then they fall into the water, and then they're immobilized and can be collected after a number of days and identified. Next slide. So for this study, there were 1,902 bees collected over 23 weeks in weekly surveys of all these sites. 5 families of bees were observed. By far the most dominant species of bee in this particular experiment with this type of trapping system were what we call sweat bees. They're cute little bees. They can be the color of green emeralds. They fly very quickly, much more efficiently than bumblebees or honeybees. So you hardly miss them. You might think they're flies, but they're the most common bees. They're ground nesting bees as well. So when the habitats are disturbed, their nests are disturbed as well, and it may take a lot of time for them to recover. Then the next most popular bee was the Megachilidae, mason or leaf-cutting bees. They found 273 of these. The mason leaf-cutting part means that they actually are masonry masters when they build their ground nest, or they use cut leaves to kind of cement together some sort of a hive, but they don't really, they're solitary bees, so they're just making a small little provision tube for maybe 1 larva. So that's the idea. And in fact, the truth of the matter is that most bees don't form great hives like our honeybee. They're mostly solitary. So that being said, the next most abundant bee were the Apidae, and those include our European honeybee, bumblebees, and the like. They found 156 of those. And then the rarer bees would be the adrenids or mining bees. And again, this tells you that they are uniquely involved with the loamy sand there at Sanford. They're using that sand to build their small provision nests underground. And then finally, they found 3 Coletidae or plaster bees. And these bees are a more primitive bee, but they're very good at using their saliva to build their nest cells in a way that a mason would be very jealous. So that was what that study told us. And so I feel that that's a very good thing that this diversity of bees are still out at Hanford. And if we leave these systems be, if we let them, that is to say, no pun, but if we don't drive over them too much, if we don't disturb the soils, if we can keep fires down and let natural systems work in a natural way, maybe only using lightning strikes as the indicator of whether a wildfire would be needed, then we can see these ecosystems become more resilient and more back in their natural earlier forms before colonization. Next slide. This is the final numbers, the graphs of that pollinator study. What's important to understand about most insect populations is that they respond to warm weather. So these spikes in abundance is part of the typical dynamics of insects during warmer weather. There's a peak of population and then a decrease as the days become shorter and the cooler weather occurs. And then that was the upper graph. The lower graph breaks apart the 5 families that we spoke to. And the main thing is that the Halictidae was the dominant species. And that the other 4 families peaked maybe in mid-June and then rapidly declined. So the halictids seem to be a very robust species in the Hanford ecosystem. And then the final maybe take-home message is Lepidopteran numbers were small for this study, but they weren't really targeting Lepidopterans. So we'd want to create a different type of study to census Lepidopterans or butterflies and moths. Alrighty, I've been monitoring the chat and I see there's a number of questions and we're just about done. So let's go to the last couple of slides. We've covered general insect importance, the geology and the plant communities of Hanford, the effects of the frequent wildfires. At least 2 invasive species were covered today. There's many more. The interconnectedness, I've tried to impress upon the group that it does exist if it's understood and looked for. And some of those links are very fragile and can be easily disturbed. There's a lot of great pollinators out there in Hanford, and we should just be sure to promote those populations as best we can. And then I'm open to ideas. If anyone has something they'd like to speak about or talk about or discuss for aquatic insects, we've got the big reach there with all sorts of aquatic insects. This summer, we had literally mountains of caddisflies in our office there at the Port of Benton. So one can ask, well, how healthy is the Columbia River? Well, it's very healthy for caddisflies. And so we could delve into that a little bit more. There's a lot of rare butterflies that have been documented around Hanford. And the folks at Washington State University have been watching those either in full time or in their spare time. And there's more beetles and wasps to talk about. There's been beetle studies as well that we could talk about. And then I'd also like to bring in the ecology. Our mission in ecology is to try to guide the process forward so that future generations, well beyond our time, will know that whatever restoration is ongoing at Hanford, they can be sure that radiation levels are as low as possible, heavy metals are well taken care of, that all of the contained material is staying contained over the millennia, no matter how many storms or floods come, that what Hanford is all about is a multi-use area. The Department of Energy does want to continue with the mission of multiple sources of energy. And so along with that could be a showcase of the incredible diversity of nature that can coexist with some of the cutting edge energy production. So ecology would be happy to be part of that conversation. So I go to the next slide, and I am happy to answer any questions that are forming or in the future.
George, thank you so much. That was massively educational. I learned far more about sex than I had in the 4 years I've been in ecology. You're right. We have a couple of questions if we can just hop right into them. But first, I just want to throw the pitch out there. If anybody has any questions, please drop them into either the Facebook chat or the Zoom chat. I'm also going and enabling folks on the Zoom version of the chat that you can unmute yourself and turn on your camera if you want to ask George your question yourself. So feel free to turn on your question if you just want to ask a question that way. While we're waiting for more questions to come in, we do have a couple that came in on Zoom, George. The first question was from Marissa Merker, who asked, are the wasps damaging to the ecology as well? I think you said they were also invasive.
They're invasive. And for example, the one we talked about, Vespula vulgaris, I think I'm saying the name correctly. It's interesting. I was just reading a book, and it's called Endless Forms, written by a wasp expert. And I'd quote right from that. Basically, yes, wasps are generalist predators. Yes, they can damage things by, say, eating a caterpillar here or a caterpillar there. But in general, nature balances itself. No smart wasp is going to eat every single caterpillar in its neighborhood because they'll starve. There won't be any caterpillars to reproduce for next year. So in all natural systems, there is equilibriums. So it's never perfect, but that's just the natural balances and dynamics that occur, predator-prey interactions. Wasps can be scary. A close friend of mine was attacked by wasps 2 days ago. It was unexpected. They were mowing their lawn, and I got photographs of a swollen foot and a photograph of the wasp itself. It was the European wasp. That's very common. Actually, it's on every continent now. So what do you do when you find the nest? Well, Home Depot has a product for maybe less than $10 that has an aerosol can that shoots maybe 15 feet. And so you indeed pick a cool morning hour and go out there with your product, and you can remove that wasp temporarily from the yard. But you also want to balance that again. You have a lot of spiders in your yard. Wasps are one of the very best predators for spiders. So these are conversations that it's tricky. Folks have always been scared of insects. I've been scared of wasps. I was stung very badly as a kid. So, but good question, Marissa. And wasps are complicated. They're very smart. They can be harmful and helpful.
Thanks, George. Our next Zoom question that we had that came in was from Mia Burke, who asked, how has Hanford's contamination affected the insect species on site, if you have any knowledge of that?
I've heard urban legends, and I won't repeat them, but I've never, of those legends, I've never found anything like real hard evidence. It was just maybe, hey, we had this spill in 2017 and there was an ant nest next to it, and that's it. There's no one that's gone out and said, yes, that ant ended up being eaten by a bird and now that bird's contaminated and it flew into Richland. there's, as far as I know, there's no real what we call bioaccumulation that I know of. So over the years since the 40s, I think we've done a really good job of just monitoring how wildlife interacted with the site. And I'm sure during the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, wildlife was kind of pushed out of the important radioactive areas. And then when we closed everything down and changed the mission, we invited wildlife back in, but we've always been very careful to sequester them outside of any reactors that are mothballed or canyons that are mothballed or being closed down. So we're always aware of any evidence of wildlife interacting. There's very well studied literature. We know how deep the ants can tunnel. So we try to do our soil analysis and our heavy metal removal at least down to where the wildlife is going into the earth, which is roughly 10 to 15 feet, depending on who you talk to. I'm not an expert in that area, and I don't know that there is a lot of published information on it. But I personally wouldn't worry about it. I know that my dose of radiation, I get way more radiation than I'd ever get eating an insect from Hanford than when I'm going up in airplanes, when I'm taking my dental x-rays. I mean, so I just look at the big picture, and that's just my opinion that we're doing a really good job in terms of keeping Hanford a safe place for wildlife.
Awesome. I'll take a second here, pause. Dana, do you know if we have any questions that came in on Facebook yet?
No, we don't. It's peaceful over here in Facebook land.
Well, I think I did just see another one that came in for Zoom from Matthew Campbell. And Matthew asks, is ecology concerned about DF law, direct feed low activity waste, diesel boiler emissions impacting pollinators? Will there be pollinator monitoring efforts in the future? If that question is a bit out of your realm, George, we can take it back to some of our SMEs, but feel free to answer that if you know the answer.
I'm just writing some notes down. DF law, diesel emission. So I don't know DF law, the exact numbers of what is allowed, say per second or particulates per hour or so forth. But for pollinators, I wouldn't. I myself, insects are pretty robust, and in general, worldwide, pollinators can coexist with all sources of diesel fumes and diesel emissions. So I personally am not too concerned about DFLAW and its effect on pollinators that are within the reserve itself. But that's a good question. I do not know of any studies on actual diesel effects on insects like like looking at that. So that might be something a graduate student at one of the universities would like to take on or something.
And the second part of his question, I know you covered during your presentation that pollinator report. Do you know if there's going to be any future pollinator monitoring efforts in the future?
That would be, I think, a conversation between the HAB, DOE, and then the document that I cited, the Hanford Site Biological Resources Management Plan. I don't know that there's any language in there that says we must conduct X surveys every X years, but it certainly should be something that should be done. And it's, in terms of the bigger budget picture, it's a drop in the bucket. And it really, it would help, I think, in the long term, knowing like when folks come to visit Hanford for public relations, they can come and say, hey, here's this pollinating area, and we've studied it for the last 50 years, and we're doing great because each year we're getting more diversity. But if we don't have data, we wouldn't know. So that's a great question. I should actually check on that, looking at the plan.
Awesome. Thanks,
if there's
George.
anything going. Yeah.
And then another question we had was from Mia again, and Mia asked, and this is a fun one. In honor of Halloween and Dia de los Muertos, do you have any spooky, strange, unexpected stories about insects at Hanford?
Um, oh my goodness. Well, I've been employed here for years, so I don't have more than a year's worth. But yeah. Okay, so 4 or 5 weeks ago, I was walking along the bike path, not on Hanford, but near Hanford, near WSU, and I saw this black wasp really flying quickly, kind of like, well, what's this black wasp doing? I'm scared of black wasps already. And it turned out it was dragging this giant spider, a very juicy, thick, yummy spider, and doing its job, killing spiders, and it was dragging it along because it was too big for it to carry by flying. And then it was carrying it to this underground cave where it will literally take the dead petrified spider and encase it maybe in a silken web so that's when the baby spiders want to munch on that, it'll be there for them. And spiders have these unique chemicals along with wasps. They can literally create, not actually kill an insect, but immobilize it so that it's in a paralytic state, but it's not literally decomposing. So it's yummy and fresh as soon as the babies want to start eating it, maybe in a week or two. So that's, the insect world is very interesting that way. Yeah, we could talk all night about the crazy things that insects do to each other, and some of it's really perfect for Halloween.
Oh, that's awesome. Before we go into any other questions and do a Facebook check-in, I had my own question I wanted to ask. If I know you've been with ecology for about a year, so you might be familiar with that. We get a lot of spiders around our ecology office in Richland that like to sit in the bushes and up on the windows and stuff. Do you know what most common type of spider we have at our office is? Do you know off the top
Well,
of your head?
I saw a couple over the summer. They're orb weavers, and Alicia Boyd, my colleague, knows spider identification better than I do. So I just, they're there, but I don't know specifically, other than the orb weaver family, what's going on. But what I would recommend is that we don't kill our wasps so quickly. We let these wasp nests be part of the outside kind of yard of our area, and I think we'd see a reduction in spiders.
Okay. Well, let's take a second. Dana, do we have any comments or questions on the Facebook side of things?
We do. We have one comment. This is from Carrie Miller. She says, "Thank you for this very interesting presentation. I haven't been for a visit home in a long time, but I recognize all the plants and insects you shared, and I'm so glad that they are all still thriving out on the area."
Mhm. Yeah. Long live native plants.
Awesome. Well, I'm trying to see if I've got any more on Zoom real quick. We'll throw another pitch out there. If you have your insect questions for George, feel free to ask anything you've got on the Zoom chat or Facebook chat. While we're waiting for any other final questions, Dana, do you have any questions for George? I know you and I were talking at length about insects before the meeting.
Well, one of the questions that I had, well, while we were watching the presentation, is that really cool chart you have for the bugs through the millennia. What is the oldest known insect?
So again, my personal studies and the research that I've done, it's a point of contention when we look way back in what's called fossils in Canada, the Burgess Shale fossils. We see things that look like insects, not really trilobites, but just kind of centipede creatures, wormy creatures, things that have segmented bodies. So some people are arguing that those are the proteo insects. Those were the first real insect ancestors. But in terms of the DNA and the phylogenetics, that circular picture that I showed you, it has what are called the silverfish or the diplurans. They also have the collembola, which are an insect type of kind of a proto-insect. So all of those are part of what we think are the proto-insects, or the beginning or the most ancient insect families. And of course, they're still alive today. So the fossil record and what's existing today, you can kind of fill your plate with both of them and see which one you like the best. But we're talking about things that haven't changed for hundreds of million years when we talk about things like silverfish. So very ancient insect lines. I hope that begins to answer the question. And Dana, we can I can point you to books that talk about those types of arguments, and this insect and that insect and the fossil record, and one scientist is claiming it looks like it's this way and that way. So that's cutting edge that we really need to continue to debate going forward.
Awesome. Thanks, George. So we had a couple more comments come in on Zoom. One of them just said, for Mia, was a response to your spooky story. That just thanked you for your fantastically spooky story. And then she had one more question for you, which was, what kind of field work do you get to get into with your position with us?
So it's all on my free time. So my walks just through the area. I don't when I'm on Hanford, I'm on government business, so I don't stop and look at the flowers or get out of the car without permission. And so far, I don't have permission to do that. But the ecosystems around Hanford are easily accessible, and I'm always looking for things to do. I like to do pitfall traps, and just to understand what's there in a disturbed system versus something that's kind of more pristine and native. The aquatic insects are very interesting to me. One of the things that's very interesting to me is the way that the water levels along the Columbia fluctuate depending on how the dams and the Army Corps of Engineers decide to move the flows around. But aquatic insects haven't evolved with those types of damming systems. So I'm curious about aquatic insects and how they're struggling or thriving, depending on how we're manipulating the water levels. Sometimes rapidly, like within 2 or 3 days, it's dropping like a foot. And that can mean death to an aquatic insect when it's exposed. So there's lots of interesting questions that still could be investigated in Hanford, for sure.
Absolutely. Well, I don't see any more questions or comments. We'll just do one final call. If anybody has any questions, please drop them in the chat. I'll ask you one question I had just to give anybody a last chance. So George, out of all the insects you know about at Hanford so far, what's one of the most unique insects that you know about that maybe the common person might not know like exists out there?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Well, I really like this black wasp that I saw on the WSU campus, and I would suspect that it's also on the Hanford site too. Like I say, it's really when I'm on site, I'm focused on the business of the Department of Energy, and so I can't say a lot about what I've seen other than what gets splattered on the windshield when I'm driving. But there's some really interesting wasps around this part, especially this alluvial plain, the Missoula floods, the Palouse area, the scablands. It's not well studied, and it's impacted so much by human agriculture that I think that I would say that black wasp I talked about that was getting that big juicy, they move so quickly. And being someone that's been stung by wasps before, it's just like, oh, okay, calm it down. It's just a wasp. It's not looking for you. It's looking for spiders. So yeah, I would say, and I don't know the species of that wasp. There is a common name for it, but it's known to be a spider predator. So that's it for me.
Awesome. Well, one final check on Facebook, Dana. Do we have anything else on there?
No, it's still very peaceful over here.
All righty. Well, some really great questions and an amazing presentation. George, we'll go ahead and start rounding out for the night. I just want to remind everybody that tonight's presentation was recorded. I'll be having it up on the Ecology YouTube channel tomorrow or sometime the next couple days. and it'll also be up on our Hanford Facebook page, the Ecology Hanford Facebook page, that you could see the link there. We're also going to put the link to the recording as well as a copy of the slideshow on our website on ecology.wa.gov/Hanford. We have a public education page that it'll be on. So if you want to rewatch George's awesome presentation or just look at his slides, they'll be available in the next couple days. And as we move forward from this presentation, we'd love to have George back for another insect visit. And if you have ideas for George or for any other future Let's Talk About Hanford on any other topic, please reach out to us. Again, our email is hanford@ecy.wa.gov. I think I'll turn it over really quick to George. George, do you have anything else you want to share before we close this for the night?
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Ryan.
Awesome.
And thanks to Dana for some great coaching, Dana. Couldn't have done it without you. Thank you.
You're welcome. It's been fun.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I hope everybody has a fantastic night. Thanks for spending your Wednesday evening with us, and hope you all have a delightful weekend. And we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Bye, everybody.